The film Goodfellas painted the moment as abrupt, clean, almost theatrical. A barber chair, a few gunshots, chaos contained within seconds. But the truth was far darker. The death of Albert Anastasia was not just an assassination. It was the inevitable climax of a life built on calculated brutality, institutional violence, and a reputation so terrifying that even his allies feared him more than their enemies. To understand how he died, one must first understand how he lived. He was not born Albert Anastasia. He entered the world in 1902 as Albert Anastasia in the coastal town of Tropea, Italy, a place where survival demanded strength, and weakness was punished early. His father worked on the railroads. His mother struggled to hold the family together. By the time Umberto was still a boy, hardship had already carved something rigid inside him. In 1917, at just 15 years old, he arrived in New York. The city did not welcome him. It consumed him. Brooklyn's waterfront became his first proving ground. Longshoremen fought for scraps of work under the watch of corrupt foremen and criminal enforcers. Violence was currency. Loyalty was temporary. And fear was the only true authority. It was here that Anastasia learned his first rule. Power belonged to those willing to use it without hesitation. He quickly developed a reputation, not just for strength, but for something colder, something more dangerous. He did not simply react to violence. He initiated it. By the early 1920s, he was already entangled in serious crime. His first known murder came during a dockside dispute. A fellow worker disappeared. Witnesses remained silent. The pattern had begun. But Anastasia's rise was not accidental. It was guided. He came under the influence of Joe Masuria, one of New York's dominant crime bosses at the time. Masuria recognized something in the young immigrant, a willingness to cross lines others hesitated to approach. Under Masuria, Anastasia found structure, purpose, and opportunity. The underworld of New York in the 1920s was shifting. Old world traditions were clashing with New World ambition. Prohibition had turned organized crime into an empire. Alcohol flowed illegally, but money flowed freely. And with money came war. The conflict between Masuria and his rival, Salvatore Maranzano, would later be known as the Castellamarese War. It was not just a power struggle, it was a purge. Assassinations became routine. Alliances dissolved overnight. Trust was a liability. Anastasia thrived in this chaos. He was not a strategist. He was an instrument. Reliable, ruthless, effective. According to multiple documented accounts, Anastasia became one of the most feared enforcers in New York during this period. He did not question orders. He executed them, and he executed them well. When Masuria was ultimately betrayed and killed in 1931, an operation orchestrated by rising figures like Lucky Luciano, Anastasia adapted quickly. Loyalty, for him, was never emotional. It was practical. He aligned himself with Luciano's vision of a modernized mafia, a national structure, a commission, an organization that functioned like a corporation, with rules, divisions, and efficiency. But even within this new system, there remained a need for something more primitive, a mechanism of control, a way to eliminate problems quietly. This is where Anastasia's role became truly significant. He became a central figure in what would later be known as Murder Incorporated, a loosely organized group of contract killers operating across the United States. Though the exact structure remains debated, investigators later discovered that Anastasia acted as one of its primary overseers. Orders came down, targets were assigned, executions were carried out with precision. It was systematic, businesslike, terrifying. Victims ranged from rival gangsters to disloyal associates. Some disappeared, others were found, left as warnings. And Anastasia stood at the center of it all. He earned a nickname during these years, the Lord High Executioner. It was not meant as exaggeration. By the late 1930s, law enforcement began to piece together the scale of violence connected to murder. Incorporated informants describe a network of killers operating with near impunity. Names surfaced, patterns emerged, and one name kept appearing, Albert Anastasia. But proving his involvement was another matter entirely. Witnesses vanished, evidence dissolved, fear ensured silence. Even within organized crime, Anastasia was viewed differently. He was not merely respected, he was feared. Other bosses understood his value, but also his unpredictability. He was a weapon that could not easily be controlled once unleashed. As the 1940s approached, Anastasia's power continued to grow. He secured influence over the Brooklyn waterfront, controlling unions, shipping, and labor. It was a lucrative domain. Millions passed through those docks, and Anastasia ensured that a portion of it always flowed upward. At the same time, the structure of the mafia itself continued to evolve. After Luciano's imprisonment and eventual deportation, figures like Frank Costello rose to prominence. Costello preferred diplomacy over violence. He built political connections. He avoided unnecessary bloodshed. Anastasia, however, represented the opposite approach. Force, intimidation, finality. The partnership between Costello and Anastasia became one of convenience. Costello provided legitimacy and political cover. Anastasia provided enforcement. Together, they maintained power. But beneath the surface, tensions were forming. The Commission, the governing body of organized crime, relied on balance. No single figure could dominate two completely. No single faction could operate without oversight. Anastasia disrupted that balance. His reputation made him dangerous not just to enemies, but to allies. Stories circulated within the underworld. Men who had crossed him disappeared without warning. Others were killed for reasons that were never fully explained. Whether all these stories were true mattered less than the effect they produced. Fear became his identity. And fear, over time, breeds resistance. By the early 1950s, a new generation of mafia leaders began to question Anastasia's methods. His unpredictability, his brutality, his growing independence. Among them was Vito Genovese. Genovese had his own ambitions. He had waited years for power, and he understood something critical. Anastasia could not be reasoned with. He could only be removed. But removing a man like Anastasia was not simple. He was protected. Loyalists surrounded him. His reputation alone deterred most attempts against his life. Any move against him would require precision, coordination, and absolute secrecy, because failure would not mean retaliation. It would mean annihilation. Meanwhile, Anastasia himself remained unaware, or perhaps unconcerned. He continued his routines, maintained his authority, issued orders with the same cold certainty that had defined his entire career. To those around him, he appeared untouchable. But power in organized crime is never permanent. It shifts quietly, often invisibly, and by the time the target realizes it, it is already too late. In October 1957, subtle movements began within the mafia's upper ranks. Meetings took place behind closed doors. Conversations ended abruptly when outsiders entered the room. Names were spoken carefully. Plans were formed slowly, because what was being discussed was not just another hit. It was something far more significant. The removal of one of the most feared men in American criminal history, Albert Anastasia. And on the morning of October 25th, he walked into the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, completely unaware that the decision had already been made. Completely unaware that the decision had already been made. The Park Sheraton Hotel stood as a symbol of quiet luxury in Midtown Manhattan. Its lobby carried the low hum of routine. Businessmen moving briskly, staff maintaining order, the illusion of normalcy intact. Albert Anastasia entered without hesitation. This was part of his routine. Predictable, consistent, and that predictability, according to multiple documented accounts, would become the very vulnerability his enemies had been waiting for. He was heading to the hotel's barbershop. A simple appointment, a mundane act, one that required him to sit still, exposed. Inside, the barbershop was calm. Mirrors lined the walls. Chairs stood evenly spaced, towels folded with precision. The scent of shaving cream lingered in the air. Anastasia took his seat. He removed his jacket. The barber draped a white cloth around his chest. And for a brief moment, the man known as the Lord High Executioner appeared almost ordinary. But the truth was already closing in. Investigators later discovered that the assassination had not been impulsive. It was not a spontaneous act of revenge. It was carefully planned, timed, and approved at the highest levels of organized crime. The film Goodfellas would later depict the scene with a degree of stylization. Two gunmen bursting in, firing rapidly, chaos erupting in seconds. But the real sequence of events was more controlled, more deliberate, and far more unsettling. At approximately 10:15 a.m., two men entered the barber shop. They were not masked. They did not rush. They moved with purpose. Witnesses would later describe them as calm, almost detached. Their presence did not immediately trigger alarm. In a place like the Park Sheridan, men in suits came and went constantly. The assassins positioned themselves behind Anastasia. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then, without warning, the first shot was fired. The bullet struck Anastasia in the upper body. The sound shattered the room. Before he could fully react, a second shot followed. Then a third. Then several more. The attackers did not hesitate. They fired in rapid succession, aiming to ensure there would be no survival. Anastasia attempted to rise. Instinct, reflex, but the positioning of the barber chair and the shock of the initial shots made movement difficult. The white cloth tangled around him as he struggled. What followed became one of the most widely reported details of the assassination. The mirrors. As the gunfire continued, Anastasia lashed out, not at the shooters, but at their reflections. Disoriented, wounded, and reacting under extreme stress, he struck toward the mirror in front of him, believing it to be his attackers. It was a moment of confusion, a moment of vulnerability, and it lasted only seconds. The gunman closed the distance. More shots were fired. By the time they stopped, Anastasia had been hit multiple times. His body collapsed backward in the barber chair, then slid partially to the floor. The entire attack lasted less than a minute. Then, just as calmly as they had entered, the assassins turned and walked out. No panic, no pursuit. They disappeared into the flow of the hotel, leaving behind a scene that would soon become one of the most infamous crime images in American history. The barber shop fell silent. Then came a shock. Employees froze. Customers scrambled. Some attempted to flee. Others stood paralyzed, unable to process what had just occurred. Within minutes, hotel security arrived. Then the police. But the perpetrators were already gone, and they would never be officially identified. According to multiple documented accounts, the assassination had been sanctioned by powerful figures within the Mafia Commission. The motive was clear. Anastasia had become too dangerous, too unpredictable, too independent. His methods, once useful, had begun to threaten the stability of the entire organization. At the center of the conspiracy, investigators and historians would later point to Vito Genovese. Genovese had both motive and ambition. He sought greater control over the Mafia's operations in New York. But to achieve that, he needed to eliminate obstacles. Anastasia was the largest of them. But Genovese could not act alone. Support came from within Anastasia's own circle, most notably from Carlo Gambino. Gambino had long been a subordinate within Anastasia's organization. Quiet, patient, observant. But beneath that calm exterior, he had been building alliances, waiting, positioning himself for the moment when power could be taken. The assassination at the Park Sheridan was not just the removal of a boss. It was a transfer of power, and it was executed with precision. The aftermath was immediate. News of the killing spread rapidly across New York. Headlines captured the brutality of the scene. A mafia boss gunned down in a luxury hotel in broad daylight. It was a direct challenge, not just to law enforcement, but to the very structure of organized crime. Because such an act required approval, coordination, agreement, and that meant something significant had shifted behind the scenes. Law enforcement launched an investigation. Witnesses were questioned. Descriptions were collected. Timelines were reconstructed. But the same problem persisted. No one talked. Those who had seen the gunman could offer only vague descriptions. Faces blurred by shock. Details lost in the chaos. And within the underworld, silence was absolute. Omerta, the code of silence, held firm. Even those who knew the truth understood the consequences of speaking. Death. The barbershop itself became a crime scene frozen in time. Blood stained the floor. The overturned chair remained where Anastasia had fallen. Mirrors, some cracked from the impact of bullets, reflected the aftermath. Investigators documented everything, but evidence alone could not solve the case. Because the real story existed beyond the physical scene. It existed in meetings that had taken place weeks earlier, in agreements made without records, in decisions enforced without signatures. And as the investigation stalled, something else began to unfold. Power began to realign. Within days, Carlo Gambino emerged as the new head of the organization that had once belonged to Anastasia. It was a transition that appeared almost seamless. Too seamless. There was no internal war, no prolonged conflict, no visible resistance, which, according to investigators later, suggested something critical. The decision to remove Anastasia had not been controversial within the commission. It had been accepted, perhaps even welcomed. But while Gambino consolidated power and Genovese strengthened his position, the consequences of the assassination continued to ripple outward. Because eliminating Anastasia solved one problem, but it created another. A precedent. If a boss could be removed so openly, so efficiently, then no one was truly safe. And within the highest levels of organized crime, that realization began to take hold. Quietly, uneasily, because the system they had built relied on stability, control, balance, and the assassination at the Park Sheridan had disrupted all three. Behind closed doors, discussions resumed. Concerns were raised, not about Anastasia, but about what came next. Because power, once taken through violence, demands to be defended the same way. And as Vito Genovese moved closer to consolidating control over New York's underworld, others began to question whether they had simply replaced one threat with another. Others began to question whether they had simply replaced one threat with another. The removal of Albert Anastasia had been swift, efficient, approved, but it had also exposed something dangerous within the structure of organized crime. If a boss could be eliminated in broad daylight, inside a luxury hotel, then the rules were no longer fixed. They were flexible, and flexibility, in a system built on power, breeds instability. In the weeks following the assassination, Carlo Gambino consolidated his position with remarkable precision. There were no public displays of force, no unnecessary violence. He understood something Anastasia never fully embraced. Power did not need to be loud to be absolute. Gambino moved quietly, reinforcing alliances, rewarding loyalty, and ensuring that the transition appeared natural. To the outside world, it seemed as though the organization had simply adjusted. But inside the commission, the atmosphere had changed. Because the greater concern was no longer Anastasia. It was Vito Genovese. Genovese had played a central role in orchestrating the assassination. That much, according to multiple documented accounts, was widely understood within the upper ranks of organized crime. He had removed a powerful rival and positioned himself closer to dominance over New York. But in doing so, he had revealed his intentions. An intention, in that world, was everything. Other bosses began to take notice. Among them was Frank Costello. Costello had survived an assassination attempt earlier in 1957, an attack widely believed to have been ordered by Genovese himself. Though Costello lived, the message had been clear. Step aside. And he did. But stepping aside did not mean surrendering influence. Costello remained a respected figure, connected, observant, and most importantly, cautious. He understood Genovese's ambition, and he understood its consequences, because Genovese was not interested in balance. He wanted control, total control. The commission, however, had been built to prevent exactly that. It functioned as a governing body, ensuring that no single leader could dominate the entire structure. Decisions required agreement. Actions required justification. Genovese threatened that balance. And so, quietly, opposition began to form. Investigators would later uncover fragments of this shift, not through direct testimony, but through patterns. Meetings between unlikely allies, sudden changes in alliances, a subtle but unmistakable resistance building beneath the surface. But the real turning point came not from within the mafia, but from outside it. Law enforcement had been watching. For years, agencies had struggled to penetrate the inner workings of organized crime. The Code of Silence, Omerta, had protected its members. Witnesses refused to speak. Evidence was scarce. Cases collapsed. But the assassination of Anastasia had drawn attention. Public attention, political attention. And with that attention came pressure. Authorities intensified their efforts. Surveillance increased. Informants were pursued more aggressively. Financial records were scrutinized. And eventually, an opportunity emerged. In 1959, just 2 years after Anastasia's death, Vito Genovese was indicted on federal narcotics charges. The case was built on testimony from a key witness, one whose credibility would later be questioned, but whose statements were enough to move the prosecution forward. According to investigators, the charges were not entirely coincidental. There had been cooperation, information shared, possibly even from within the mafia itself, because by this point, Genovese had become a liability. His ambition had disrupted the balance. His actions had created instability, and his removal, much like Anastasia's, had become necessary. The trial proceeded. Evidence was presented. Testimony was given. And despite the complexities surrounding the case, the outcome was decisive. Genovese was convicted. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. It was a significant moment. One of the most powerful figures in American organized crime had been removed, not by assassination, but by the legal system. But the truth behind his conviction remained layered. Because while the courts delivered the sentence, the circumstances that led to it had been shaped elsewhere, within the commission, within the same system that had ordered Anastasia's death. And so, the cycle continued. Power removed, power replaced, balance restored, at least temporarily. Meanwhile, Carlo Gambino solidified his legacy. Unlike Anastasia, Gambino avoided unnecessary attention. He minimized violence. He prioritized profit over spectacle. Under his leadership, the organization became one of the most stable and powerful crime families in the United States. It was a different kind of rule, less visible, but no less effective. And yet, the shadow of Anastasia remained. His death had become more than an event. It had become a symbol, a reminder of what happened when power grew too aggressive, too visible, too feared. The image of the barber shop, the shattered mirrors, the fallen chair, the blood on the floor, continue to circulate in reports and case files. A moment frozen in time, a warning, because the film Goodfellas, like many dramatizations, simplified the event. It captured the violence, but not the context, the shock, but not the structure. It never showed the meetings, the decisions, the quiet agreements that made the assassination possible. It never showed how a man like Anastasia could rise to power through violence and then be removed by the very system that had enabled him. But the truth was far more complex and far more unsettling. Because Anastasia was not an exception, he was a product of a system that rewarded brutality, enforced loyalty, and eliminated threats without hesitation. His death did not dismantle that system. It reinforced it. Investigators would spend decades attempting to fully understand the internal dynamics of organized crime. Testimonies from later informants would provide glimpses, partial insights into decisions that had once been hidden. But even then, the full picture remained incomplete. Because the most critical conversations, the ones that determined life and death, were never recorded. They existed only in memory. And memory, in that world, was often buried alongside those who held it. Albert Anastasia's story does not end in the barber chair. It extends beyond it, into the structure of power that replaced him, into the decisions that followed, into the realization that in organized crime, no position is permanent, no authority is absolute, and no man, no matter how feared, is beyond removal. In the end, Anastasia died the same way he had lived, surrounded by violence, defined by it, and ultimately consumed by it. Because in a world built on control, the only certainty is that control will eventually be taken away.